A veteran thought he was buying a fresh start when he paid almost nothing for a forgotten single-family house in Spokane. What he found instead was dust that whispered, a floor that hid more than wood, and a German shepherd who refused to ignore the truth. This isn't just a bargain, it's the price of justice. Listen closely, because in this house, even silence has a story. The winter sky over Spokane pressed low and gray, snowflakes drifting lazily before settling on rooftops that had long forgotten warmth. The streets were quiet, lined with bare-limbed maples and pines that creaked softly whenever a gust of wind cut through. Against this backdrop of hushed cold, an old Chevy Silverado rolled down the road, its faded red paint dulled by years of dust, sun, and service. At the wheel sat David Miller, his face half hidden beneath a thick brown beard streaked with threads of silver. His hazel eyes, sharp yet shadowed, seemed to scan not only the road ahead, but something far deeper, as if searching for an answer that no town or winter could provide. David was 42, tall but slightly stooped in his posture, the kind of man whose body carried the weight of both armor and absence. He had served nearly 2 decades in the Army, much of that time spent in deserts far from home, where the heat branded itself into his bones. A scar along his left jawline, faint yet permanent, hinted at the moment shrapnel kissed him in Kandahar. He rarely spoke of it, but the scar was only skin deep. The heavier marks sat buried within, the friends left behind, the laughter gone silent, the belief that peace was something he'd have to buy, if only for pennies. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat Rocky, his German shepherd. At 6 years old, Rocky had the proud, muscular build of his breed, his tan coat streaked with black saddling across his back, ears alert and ever listening. A faint scar traced the dog's flank, the result of an old training accident, but Rocky bore it like a badge. His amber eyes glimmered with intelligence, yet there was caution there too, the kind only a creature that had seen men break could carry. Loyal to a fault, Rocky's devotion to David had been forged not in luxury, but in long, lonely nights when silence was louder than gunfire. David drove slowly, the tires crunching over frozen gravel, until he pulled into the cul-de-sac where his new home stood. The house, a single-family structure built decades ago, was modest in frame, but carried the weary dignity of time. Its paint had peeled to a ghostly pale, shutters sagged as though sleep had overtaken them, and the porch steps tilted slightly, like bones long unsettled. To David, it was perfect, not because it was beautiful, but because it was broken in a way that mirrored himself. He parked the truck, killed the engine, and sat still for a moment, breathing in the brittle air. His gloved hands lingered on the steering wheel as he studied the house. Doubt whispered in his mind. Was he foolish to think a cheap house in a quiet city could mend what war had unraveled? Could bricks and beams really shield a man from ghosts? Rocky gave a low whine, pressing his wet nose against David's arm, grounding him back to the present. "All right, boy," David muttered, voice roughened by years of shouting across sandstorms and drills. "Let's see what $50 and a prayer got us." He pushed open the door, boots sinking into the thin crust of snow, and together they stepped onto the property. The porch groaned under his weight, boards creaking like old men clearing their throats. David slid the key into the lock, and to his surprise, it turned far too smoothly, as though the house had been waiting. The door swung open, releasing a breath of stale air, mixed with faint traces of cedar and something he couldn't quite name. He paused at the threshold, scanning the dim hallway with soldier's instinct, every nerve attuned to shadows. The foyer was small, a narrow corridor leading toward a staircase that spiraled upward. Dust coated the banister, yet the wood underneath glimmered faintly, as if polished more recently than years of abandonment should allow. Rocky padded in first, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor, ears perked forward, tail stiff. The dog sniffed the air, circled, and then sat squarely in the hallway, gaze fixed on the closed door to the left. David stepped inside, setting his duffel bag against the wall. The silence of the house pressed against him, thick and watchful. He had grown used to silence in the desert bivouacs, silence that stretched wide and infinite, but this was different. This silence felt contained, like something trapped between walls. He moved through the living room, where a stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth broad enough to sit within. A brass poker leaned in the corner, tarnished but upright, as if someone had left only yesterday. The kitchen beyond was a time capsule, avocado green appliances from the 70s, laminate counters chipped at the edges, and a calendar pinned to the fridge. December 2015, a snowy cabin scene staring back at him. David's brow furrowed. If the house had been listed as abandoned for years, who had pinned a calendar only a decade ago? Rocky's nails clicked behind him, the dog's body tense as he sniffed every corner. David crouched, running a hand along Rocky's back. "You feel it too, huh?" The dog leaned into the touch but did not relax. His ears swiveled toward the staircase, a low rumble growing in his chest. David stilled, listening, but all he heard was the groan of wood, the sigh of winter wind. Still, unease crawled across his skin. He shook it off, telling himself that old houses always sounded alive, that Rocky was simply unsettled in new territory. He unrolled a sleeping bag near the fireplace, set down a bowl of water for Rocky, and opened a can of chili for himself. They ate in silence, David chewing slowly, Rocky lapping water with ears still angled toward the upstairs. When dusk settled, David stepped outside again, hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. The yard stretched out toward a line of bare cottonwoods, their silhouettes black against the fading sky. A pickup rumbled past on the gravel road, the driver neither slowing nor waving. David noted the neutrality in his gaze, that peculiar small-town habit of seeing without acknowledging, of filing strangers into memory for later judgment. Back inside, the house greeted him with the faint crack of wood settling upstairs. Rocky stiffened instantly, head snapping toward the sound, body taut like a drawn bow. David froze, hand brushing the flashlight clipped to his belt. He waited, heart thudding, but no other noise followed. Slowly, he exhaled, muttering, "It's just the house." Just the damn house. Yet the weight of the silence that followed was undeniable. David lay down in his sleeping bag, Rocky curling against his side, one paw resting lightly on his boot. Before shutting off the flashlight, David reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver half-dollar coin he had carried since discharge, a gift from a fellow soldier who hadn't made it home. He set it on the floor, its dull shine catching the weak light. "We'll make it count," he whispered. Rocky blinked up at him, steady and calm, though his tail did not move. David closed his eyes, listening to the house breathe around them. It did not feel haunted, not exactly. It felt like a place waiting. For what? He did not know, but as Rocky pressed closer, ears twitching at every creak, David realized peace might not be what this house had to offer. Morning broke pale and cold over Spokane, the sun little more than a dim disk struggling against clouds thick with snow. Inside the house, David Miller stirred from his makeshift bed by the fireplace, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor. Rocky, his German shepherd, was already awake, pacing the hallway with a restless energy, his claws tapping rhythmically against the wood. David sat up, rubbing his temples, noting the way the dog's amber eyes flicked constantly toward the living room as if something unseen lurked there. Determined to shake the heaviness of the night before, David set to work. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak light, spilling through the windows as he began clearing out closets and cupboards. In the bedroom at the far end of the hall, he found a wardrobe standing slightly ajar. Inside hung several coats, 2 men's jackets, worn but sturdy, and 3 women's coats of varied styles, a wool pea coat, a thin rain jacket, and one with faux fur trim. Their condition unsettled him. The fabric smelled faintly of detergent, not mildew, as if they hadn't been abandoned for long. On the shelf above lay a slim leather-bound notebook. He picked it up, its pages stiff with cold. The handwriting was neat, careful, belonging to someone who believed in documenting life's smaller details. The entries spoke of daily routines, grocery lists, and school pickup times. The last entry stopped abruptly in December 2015, the ink trailing off mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted. David frowned, the unease in his chest tightening. Families didn't leave their coats and journals behind unless something tore them out of their lives. Rocky barked suddenly from the living room. David dropped the notebook and hurried out. The dog was crouched low, claws raking at a section of the floorboards near the fireplace. Dust rose with each scrape, and his growl deepened when David tried to pull him back. Kneeling, David pressed his palm against the wood. It was cooler there, faintly hollow beneath the surface. He tapped twice. The sound echoed strangely. His soldier's instincts prickled the same way they had in ruined buildings overseas, where every wall might conceal danger. He forced himself to step away, telling himself there would be time to pry open secrets later. Still, Rocky stayed near the spot, his body tense, tail stiff as a rod. Later that afternoon, as David stepped outside to catch a breath of air, he noticed someone approaching along the snowy sidewalk. A woman carried a covered tray, her stride brisk but careful in the ice. She looked to be in her early 30s, tall and slender, with chestnut-brown hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her skin was fair, touched by winter's chill, and her dark eyes held a mixture of curiosity and quiet caution. She wore a long wool coat buttoned neatly, and a scarf of deep green wool wrapped snugly around her neck. She smiled politely when she reached the porch. "You must be the new neighbor. I'm Emma Johnson. I teach 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, just a few blocks from here." Her voice was warm, tinged with a local accent, the kind of tone that softened even sharp truths. David nodded, brushing snow from his jacket sleeve before shaking her gloved hand. "David Miller. Just moved in yesterday. This is Rocky." At the sound of his name, the German shepherd padded forward, sniffing the air. Emma's eyes flicked down at him, and her smile widened faintly. "Beautiful dog. He seems protective. Always has been," David replied, scratching Rocky's ear. He noticed how Rocky did not immediately relax, his gaze steady on Emma as though measuring her intent. Emma handed over the tray, steam rising from beneath the foil cover. "I thought you could use something warm." "Cinnamon rolls. It's tradition, at least in this neighborhood, to welcome new faces with something baked." David thanked her, though the weight of her gaze lingered on the house behind him. She hesitated, her lips pressing together before she added, "That place, it used to belong to a young family." The Marshalls, nice people, a husband, wife, and their little girl. They were here one day and gone the next. No one ever explained it. The county called it foreclosure, but she trailed off, shrugging as though the story itself had been rehearsed but never resolved. David studied her carefully. Emma carried herself with composure, but there was a shadow behind her eyes, the kind carried by those who had seen too much disappointment. Teachers, he thought, often wore that look, balancing hope for their students against the weight of a system that failed them. He gestured toward the porch chair. "You want to sit a minute?" She shook her head. "I shouldn't." "Papers to grade." She paused, then added, "If you need anything, I live in the blue house across the street." Number 12. Don't hesitate. David watched her leave, her figure cutting a path through the snow until she disappeared inside her house. Rocky gave a single bark, short and sharp, before returning to his post by the suspicious patch of floor. Back inside, David carried the tray to the kitchen. He glanced again at the calendar on the fridge. Its December 2015 page frozen in time. He pressed a hand against the appliance. It was unplugged, empty, yet the magnet holding the calendar, a bright red apple, looked as though it had been placed there with purpose, not left by accident. He felt the threads of unease tightening, each detail weaving into something larger. Later, when he checked the fuse box in the basement, he found more confusion. Several wires had been cleanly cut, not frayed by age or chewed by pests, but sliced with deliberate precision. He crouched, running a calloused hand over the severed ends. Someone had meant for the house to go dark, but why? Rocky padded down the basement steps, ears pricked, nose twitching furiously. He growled low when he reached a far corner. David shone his flashlight there, but all he saw was concrete, damp with age. He exhaled, feeling the weight of fatigue, but also something sharper. Determination. He had thought peace could be bought with a cheap mortgage, but peace had never come easily to men like him. If this house had secrets, he would find them. That night, when he lay back down near the fireplace, Rocky curled against him as before. Yet the dog's body remained tense, eyes never fully closing. And David, staring at the shadowed ceiling above, admitted to himself what he had known since morning. The house was not merely old or abandoned. It was unfinished, a story cut mid-sentence. And now he was part of it. The night in Spokane deepened into a stillness that felt heavier than silence. The wind rattled the loose shutters of David Miller's new house, and the faint groan of wood carried through the empty rooms like whispers of a story long left unfinished. David lay in his sleeping bag near the fireplace, half awake, half drifting, his mind circling back to Emma Johnson's words about the family who had once lived here. His hand rested on Rocky's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of the German shepherd's breath. But suddenly Rocky stiffened. The dog's ears shot upright, and a low growl vibrated deep in his chest. He rose to his paws, padding toward the living room with urgent precision. David sat up instantly, soldier instincts flooding back, his body alert in an instant. Rocky began scratching at the floor, claws scraping against wood with a desperate rhythm. David grabbed the flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the darkened room. The spot was under a threadbare rug, one David hadn't yet bothered to roll away. Rocky tore at its edge, teeth gripping, until David knelt to help, pulling the rug aside to reveal warped wooden planks beneath. One board in particular looked out of place, darker than the rest, its edges uneven. David pressed on it. The wood gave way slightly, and the sound echoed hollow. He fetched a crowbar from his duffel, prying carefully until the board lifted with a reluctant groan. Beneath lay a small hatch, its hinges rusted, covered in dust, but intact. His chest tightened, breath caught between anticipation and dread. Houses held storage spaces, not secrets. And yet here it was. "All right, boy," David murmured, voice low and hoarse. "You found something." Rocky's amber eyes glowed in the beam, his stance tense, protective, as if he knew what waited below mattered. With a grunt, David tugged the hatch open. A cold draft rose from the darkness, carrying with it the smell of old earth and mildew. A set of narrow wooden stairs descended into blackness. He tested the first step cautiously. It creaked, but held. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight, one hand steady against the wall as he began to descend. Rocky followed close, tail low, ears forward, every muscle taut. The basement was cramped and low-ceilinged, its concrete walls stained with watermarks, shelves warped with time. Dust covered everything, but there was order, wooden crates stacked neatly, cardboard boxes lined in rows. David set the flashlight on a ledge, its beam sweeping across the space. Labels on the boxes caught his eye. Contracts, deeds, correspondence. He crouched, pulling one open, and froze. Inside lay file after file of real estate contracts, many stamped with dates and notary seals from Detroit. His brow furrowed as he flipped through them. Each document bore the same grim story. Property purchased at fractions of value, signatures scrawled shakily on lines where elderly or impoverished homeowners had been coerced to sell. David had seen desperation before, but this was methodical theft dressed as legality. Rocky nosed at another crate, whining. David lifted the lid and found old photographs, rows of brick houses in Detroit, families standing on porches with guarded expressions, faces lined with worry. On the back of one photo, scribbled in fading ink, were the words, "Forced sale, January 2009. His throat tightened. He had never lived in Detroit, but injustice wore a universal face, and it stirred something in him, something that had lain dormant beneath years of war weariness. Rocky barked sharply, drawing his attention to a corner where a metal tin had fallen. David retrieved it, prying it open. Inside was a cracked leather dog collar, stiff with age, the tag etched with the name Buddy. The collar was worn but intact, the metal cool in his palm. Rocky sniffed it, then looked up at David with an intensity that made him shiver. Dogs recognized scent across years, sometimes across generations. Rocky pressed his nose to the collar and gave a low, mournful whine. David sat back on his heels, the collar heavy in his hand. "Who were you, Buddy?" he whispered. The silence that followed seemed to press closer, as though the basement itself waited for him to piece the story together. He stacked the documents neatly, forcing himself to take slow breaths. He had seen systems chew men alive overseas, but this was home soil. And somewhere in Detroit, lives had been uprooted, not by bombs or bullets, but by paper and ink. The thought filled him with a quiet rage, one that demanded action. As he climbed back up with Rocky, he shut the hatch carefully, placing the rug over it again. He sat long into the night at the kitchen table, the collar resting beside the files. He stared at the faded letters of Buddy, wondering who had owned the dog and how its story had become buried here. Upstairs the house creaked once, the sound heavy, deliberate. Rocky raised his head, growling softly before settling back at David's feet. David's hand closed around the collar, a vow unspoken but real. The past had found him, and he could no longer pretend he had bought only a house. He had inherited a secret. Snow fell heavily the next morning, thickening the silence around David Miller's house until the world seemed wrapped in cotton. The air carried the clean bite of winter, and the street outside lay deserted, with only the faint sound of a distant snowplow humming through the neighborhood. Inside, David sat at the kitchen table, the stack of Detroit contracts spread out before him, his eyes tracing the lines of ink that felt like scars carved onto paper. Rocky lay nearby, his body taut, head resting on his paws, eyes unblinking as if guarding both man and secret. A soft knock at the door pulled David from his thoughts. When he opened it, Emma Johnson stood there again, her wool coat dusted with snowflakes, a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. Her hair, usually neatly tied, had slipped loose around her face, chestnut strands dampened by melting flakes. She offered a polite but hesitant smile. "I was thinking about what I told you yesterday," she said, her voice lower than before, more cautious. "And I couldn't stop wondering if there's more to that house than just a missing family." I know legal jargon can be hard to wade through. I thought maybe I could help. David studied her. There was sincerity in her eyes, but also curiosity edged with fear, the kind of fear that arises when someone suspects the truth but hasn't dared look it in the eye. He nodded slowly. "All right. Come in." Emma stepped inside, wiping her boots on the mat. Rocky rose immediately, padding toward her. He sniffed her cautiously, then circled once before lying down again, though his gaze never left her. Emma crouched slightly to meet the dog's eyes, whispering, "You're a good boy, aren't you?" Rocky blinked, but his ears stayed stiff. At the table, Emma slipped on a pair of reading glasses and began scanning the documents. She read aloud portions, translating dense paragraphs into plain words. "These aren't just purchases," she said after a long pause, her brow furrowed. "They're predatory contracts. Whoever orchestrated this targeted people who had no resources to fight back." She flipped through more pages until her fingers stilled on a name. "Here. Robert Hayes." David leaned closer. "Who is he?" Emma exhaled, leaning back in the chair. Robert Hayes was a veteran. Vietnam, if I'm remembering correctly. He lived in this neighborhood years ago in a small white house down the road. He was quiet, withdrawn. People said he struggled after the war, nightmares, drinking sometimes, but he was never cruel. Just hollowed out. He had a German shepherd too, buddy. They were inseparable. David's chest tightened at the familiar name. He pulled the collar from where it rested on the table, setting it down before her. The tag glinted faintly under the dim light. Buddy. Emma's lips parted, her hand rising to her mouth. That's his dog's collar. I remember Robert walking Buddy down the street. Then one day the dog was gone, and Robert was different after that, like losing Buddy was the final thread keeping him steady. Before David could respond, Rocky barked sharply, leaping to his feet. He trotted to the living room, nose pressed against a section of the wall near the fireplace, his claws scraped, wood flecks scattering. David grabbed the flashlight and crouched beside him. The plaster looked uneven, patched carelessly compared to the rest of the wall. He knocked. Hollow. With effort, he pried loose the brittle plaster. Behind it lay a shallow cavity, dust swirling in the beam of light. Inside, wrapped in a torn blanket, was a leather-bound photo album. Its cover was cracked, corners frayed. David pulled it out carefully, brushing away cobwebs before opening the first page. Photographs stared back, black and white images of a younger Robert Hayes, tall and angular, his hair once dark, his face lean with sharp cheekbones and a jaw shadowed by stubble. He wore fatigues, his expression grim but determined. Beside him stood Buddy, a German shepherd almost identical to Rocky, strong and proud, tongue lolling in a rare moment of peace. Page after page showed the two together. Robert on the porch of his old home, Buddy curled at his feet. Robert at a veterans gathering, Buddy in a harness, ears perked. The final pages grew darker. Blurry shots of documents spread across a table, contracts much like the ones David had found in the basement. One photograph captured Robert staring directly into the lens, exhaustion heavy in his eyes, as if he knew he was being recorded against his will. Emma's voice trembled. He must have hidden this. Maybe he was documenting what he uncovered. She turned another page. Scribbled in shaky handwriting beneath a photo read, "They will take everything, even Buddy." David's throat tightened, his grip on the album firm. Rocky whined softly, pressing his nose against the pages, his body language shifting from alertness to something almost mournful, as if he too recognized the lineage of loyalty stretching across generations. Emma leaned closer, her brow furrowing deeper. If Robert knew what was happening in Detroit and tried to stop it, maybe that's why his life fell apart. Maybe that's why the marshals disappeared too. David closed the album slowly, the weight of the past settling like fresh snow on his shoulders. Then this isn't just about a family that left. It's about something bigger, and Robert was caught in it. Emma reached across the table, her hand brushing the corner of the album. Her fingers were slender, pale against the worn leather. If we follow this, David, we could be stepping into something dangerous. But maybe that's exactly why we should. Rocky growled low, his eyes fixed on the darkened corner of the room, ears twitching at some sound only he could hear. David followed his gaze, the unease in his chest now undeniable. Secrets were surfacing, and they were no longer his alone. The morning sun was pale, veiled by thin clouds that diffused its light into a cold glow across Spokane. David Miller adjusted the collar of his jacket as he walked up the stone path toward Evergreen Pines retirement home, a squat brick building with ivy clinging stubbornly to its walls. His boots crunched on salted pavement, the scent of disinfectant faint even from outside. Rocky trotted at his side, ears twitching, as if already aware this visit would carry weight heavier than most. Inside, the lobby smelled of antiseptic layered with brewed coffee. A receptionist in her 20s, with dark hair tied in a neat ponytail and freckles dusted across pale skin, glanced up from her computer. Her name tag read Claire. She smiled professionally, though her voice held a faint monotony born from routine. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here to see Robert Hayes," David replied, shifting uncomfortably. He still wasn't used to asking for things, even after years of command. Claire typed quickly, her brow furrowed. "Room 214. He doesn't get many visitors." Her eyes flicked to Rocky, curiosity softening her tone. "We don't usually allow dogs inside, but maybe he'll like the company." David gave a small nod of gratitude before moving down the hall. The corridor was dim, lined with framed photographs of Spokane's past. Bridges, river rapids, old factories now silent. Each step echoed, and Rocky's nails tapped like a clock, counting down. When David opened the door to room 214, he paused. The room was small, sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds. In a worn armchair near the window sat Robert Hayes. He was a man reduced, skin sallow, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of years. His hair, once black, was now white and thinning, his cheeks hollowed. But his eyes, sharp blue, rimmed red, still carried a fire, though it flickered weakly. Robert looked up slowly, his gaze first falling on David, then drifting down to Rocky. The moment his eyes locked on the German shepherd, his breath hitched, his frail hands trembled violently, and tears welled. "Buddy?" he whispered, voice breaking. Rocky, as if understanding, padded forward and pressed his head gently against Robert's knee. The old man's hands shook as they settled into the dog's fur, stroking with desperation, with memory. Tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. You're not him. But God, you're so much like him." His voice cracked, a mixture of grief and gratitude. David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. He had seen men cry before, on battlefields, in hospital tents. But this was different. This was the cry of a soul starved for connection, revived for a moment by the echo of loyalty returned. After several minutes, Robert wiped his face with a trembling hand. His voice steadied, though hoarse. "You must be wondering why I hid things." Why I ran out of fight, David pulled up a chair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I found your files." "And the photos. I need to understand," Robert exhaled shakily, his gaze drifting to the window where snow fell in thin sheets. "Back then, after Vietnam, I thought I'd seen all the ways power could destroy lives. But here at home, it was quieter, cleaner. Contracts, signatures, polite smiles. They called it development. In Detroit, they preyed on veterans, widows, families already cornered, promised them stability, then stripped them bare. I tried to stop them, documented everything. Buddy was always with me, guarding, listening. They must have known he was my anchor. His hands clenched the armrests, knuckles pale. One night I came home, and Buddy was gone. Found his body weeks later near the quarry. Poisoned. They didn't come for me directly. They didn't need to. Taking him was enough. After that, I broke. Stopped pushing, stopped fighting. I couldn't win a war without him. Rocky whined softly, nuzzling closer, as if to fill the void left decades ago. Robert smiled faintly through the sorrow. I buried the files in that house before they could find them. I hoped maybe someone braver, someone less broken, would pick them up one day. His eyes met David's, sharp despite the years. And here you are. David felt the weight of Robert's words settle over him. He thought of his own scars, of the nights where silence pressed too hard, of how Rocky's presence had kept him tethered. He understood with startling clarity. Robert had lost his tether. And now fate, in its strange way, had returned one in Rocky's form. Robert's gaze softened as he scratched Rocky's ear. Don't make the mistake I did. Don't let them scare you into silence. Promise me you'll finish what I couldn't. David hesitated only a moment before nodding. I promise. His voice was steady, though his chest burned with both anger and resolve. For the first time, Robert leaned back, closing his eyes as though unburdened. Then maybe Buddy didn't die for nothing. His breathing steadied, a faint smile ghosting his lips as Rocky laid his head on the old man's lap. David sat in silence, watching snowflakes trace patterns against the glass. He realized the battle Robert had abandoned had now passed to him, and for the first time since stepping into the old house, he accepted it. The snow that week seemed endless, burying Spokane beneath layers of silence that no plow could fully clear. David Miller's old truck sat in the driveway, its red paint dulled and edges rimed with frost. Inside the house, the kitchen table was crowded with boxes of documents, photographs, and the battered leather album. Emma Johnson sat hunched over the pages, her reading glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose, her brown hair escaping its bun in tired wisps. David leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his hazel eyes following every page she turned as if searching for a threat hidden in the ink itself. Rocky patrolled restlessly, his nails tapping on the wood floor, pausing often at the front door, his ears flicking toward distant sounds only he could hear. They had already agreed to send copies of the files to a local journalist Emma trusted. But every step toward exposing the truth had felt like stepping deeper into crosshairs. That morning, when David started his truck to drive to town, the brake pedal sank uselessly beneath his boot. He'd killed the engine instantly, his pulse hammering as he checked underneath. The brake lines had been neatly sliced. Whoever was watching them wasn't clumsy. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, David discovered the back door lock forced open, its frame splintered. Nothing inside had been stolen, but the message was clear. We can reach you whenever we want. Rocky had growled so fiercely at the threshold that David half expected teeth marks left in the intruder's shadow. Emma, shaken but composed, tried to steady her voice. David, maybe we should stop. These people aren't bluffing. They don't want this story told. We could hand it all to the police. Let them decide what's next. Her dark eyes reflected fear, but also reason. She wasn't weak, just practical, the way teachers had to be when balancing hope against reality. David rubbed a hand over his beard, the bristles scratching his palm. Memories of Afghanistan surged, the times when pulling back meant survival, when orders screamed retreat, but hearts wanted to hold the line. He'd learned then that silence could kill as surely as bullets. His gaze drifted to Rocky, who had taken position at the door, body rigid, amber eyes fixed outward into the storm. The dog's stance was steady, immovable, as if guarding not just the house, but the decision itself. Look at him, David said quietly. He knows. We stop now, we might as well bury the truth again. That's not why we're here. Emma's lips pressed into a line. She wanted to argue, but Rocky's unwavering presence silenced her. Instead, she sighed, folding another stack of papers. Then we do it smart. No heroics. We protect ourselves while we move forward. The next evening, David drove Emma's car to meet the journalist at a diner on the outskirts of town. The man waiting in a booth by the window was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with a weathered look. His name was Mark Stevens, a local reporter with salt and pepper stubble and tired green eyes. His corduroy jacket was frayed at the elbows, his notepad already open. Mark had built a reputation for chasing uncomfortable truths, which had cost him promotions and friends in the industry. His voice carried a clipped edge, like a man who no longer cared for pleasantries. "You've stirred something dangerous," Mark said after hearing their story. "Detroit developers don't play fair. I've seen how deep their pockets run." He flipped through the copies Emma handed over, his brow furrowing. "These contracts, this isn't just greed. It's systemic theft, and if they've already come after you, they won't stop." David's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure it's worth it. Publish it. Shine a light." Mark nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on Emma. "You realize what happens when we go public? No turning back. You'll be targets, not just annoyances." Emma sat straighter, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath. "We know." But silence hasn't helped anyone. When they left the diner, the icy night air stung their faces. Rocky, waiting in the back of the car, barked once, sharp and insistent, before quieting. As David drove, headlights appeared behind them, following too closely along the empty road. The car shadowed them for miles until David turned abruptly onto a side street, tires skidding slightly on packed snow. The vehicle behind slowed, then disappeared into the night. Emma gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white. "They're watching us everywhere." Back at the house, David checked every window, reinforced the doors, and kept the crowbar within reach. Rocky stationed himself by the front door again, his body tense, but his gaze steady. David crouched beside him, scratching the thick fur along his neck. "You're right, boy. We can't back down now." That night, while Emma slept fitfully on the couch, David lay awake by the fire, the silver coin glinting on the floor beside him. He thought of Robert Hayes, broken by the loss of Buddy, and how easily he himself might fall if Rocky were taken from him. He clenched his fist, whispering to the shadows of the house, "You won't scare us into silence." Rocky stirred, lifting his head, and with a quiet huff, pressed his paw against David's boot, an anchor, a vow. The snow that morning fell softer than it had in weeks, as if the storm itself had exhausted its rage. Spokane lay hushed beneath a pale sky, rooftops lined with frost like lace. Inside David Miller's house, the kitchen table was transformed into a command post. Documents, photographs, and copied contracts stretched across every surface. A coffee pot steamed in the corner, its warmth a fragile shield against the chill. Emma Johnson sat at the table, her slender frame wrapped in a navy cardigan. She rubbed her tired eyes, pushing stray strands of brown hair back into a bun that refused to stay neat. Her voice, though husky from lack of sleep, carried steel. "We've done all we can here. It's time to move beyond Spokane. Local officials are compromised. We need someone with reach." Mark Stevens leaned back in his chair, his green eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but bright with resolve. His salt and pepper stubble darkened his jaw, and lines carved from years of battles with editors and politicians deepened when he frowned. "I know someone," he said finally, "named Sarah Coleman. She's based in Denver now, used to work with me before her career took off. If anyone can get this published nationally, it's her." A day later, Sarah arrived, stepping from a rental car with purposeful strides. She was in her mid-30s, tall and willowy, with ash-blonde hair cut blunt at her shoulders. Her skin was fair, her sharp gray eyes missing little. She wore a long charcoal coat, boots polished, and a leather satchel slung across her body. Her presence radiated both competence and impatience, the air of a woman accustomed to pushing against closed doors until they gave way. She shook David's hand firmly, her grip cool and decisive. "Mark says you've got something big. He's not one for exaggeration." Her gaze shifted to Rocky, who stood at David's side like a sentinel. For a moment, the corners of her lips softened into something like awe. And this must be the famous partner. Rocky sniffed her, then gave a short approving bark before settling back at David's feet. Sarah crouched slightly, careful not to invade his space. Smart eyes. He knows things before we do. In the living room, Sarah spread out her laptop and began reviewing the files. She typed quickly, her nails clicking against the keys, pausing often to ask pointed questions. Her voice was clipped precise, but beneath her professional armor lay a spark of indignation that flared as she read deeper. This isn't just corruption. This is systemic fraud tied to veteran benefits, housing displacement, even charity funds. They built an empire on broken promises. The days blurred as they worked, their small group pulling threads together. Rocky rarely left David's side, except to pace the perimeter of the house, ears pricked, body taut whenever headlights slowed on the road outside. Twice, strangers lingered near the driveway, but Rocky's growls sent them hurrying away. On the third night, as snow fell thick and fast, Emma spotted movement outside. A dark sedan idled at the curb, its lights off. David felt the familiar tightening in his chest, like the moment before an ambush overseas. He grabbed his flashlight, but before he could step outside, Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Don't. That's what they want, fear. Our job is to finish this." They pressed harder, sending drafts and copies through encrypted channels. Mark made late-night calls, his voice low and urgent. Sarah drafted the first article, weaving the facts into a story that could not be ignored. Her sentences were scalpel-sharp, her tone uncompromising. Emma read each line aloud, her teacher's cadence turning every revelation into a lesson no one could deny. Finally, one cold dawn, the story broke. The headlines spread across national outlets. Veterans' hidden files expose real estate corruption tied to Detroit developers. Photographs of the contracts, the testimonies, and the stolen deeds filled screens and papers. The public outrage was immediate. Investigations opened within days. Within weeks, arrests followed. Officials in Detroit, lawyers in Spokane, men who had once seemed untouchable, now paraded in cuffs. At Evergreen Pines, Robert Hayes received a visit from federal investigators who thanked him for the role his evidence played. For the first time in decades, his name was cleared. His military record, once overshadowed by whispers of instability, was restored with honor. When David and Emma visited, Robert wept quietly, clutching Rocky's fur as though Buddy had returned through time itself. "You finished it," he whispered, voice hoarse with gratitude. Not long after, David received official documents confirming he was the rightful owner of the Spokane house. It was no longer a place of shadows, but one of renewal. Rocky became something of a legend in town, the dog who found the truth. Children pointed when they saw him, and even wary neighbors softened, offering waves and nods. On a morning when the snow finally began to melt, sunlight piercing through the gray, David stood on the porch with Emma, Robert, Sarah, and Rocky. The air smelled of thawing earth, of promises no longer buried. David knelt, resting a hand on Rocky's head. "We did it, partner. This isn't just a house anymore. It's home." Rocky's tail swept slowly against the wooden boards, his amber eyes reflecting the pale light of winter's end. For a moment, it seemed as though he smiled, content, victorious, and certain that no shadow could ever bury the truth again. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on fields of war, but in quiet houses, in hidden rooms, and within our own hearts. David and Rocky's story reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will one day rise to the light. And perhaps that light is not just justice, but also the quiet miracle that God places in our path, the loyal friend who will never leave, the courage to stand when silence would be easier, and the grace to keep walking even through the coldest winters. In our daily lives, we may not face corrupt empires, but we all face shadows, moments of fear, doubt, or despair. Like David, we can choose to stand firm. Like Rocky, we can remind those we love that loyalty and faith are stronger than fear. And like Emma, Robert, and Sarah, we can be part of a greater good when we refuse to turn away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage and faith, and together let us pray. May God bless you, guard your home, and send you the strength to face your battles with love, loyalty, and the quiet certainty that you are never alone.